Kia ora team, how are you both? Today's group coaching call, understanding your training zones, train smarter, not harder, and looking at heart rate, power, and pace, particularly explaining it for new runners, cyclists, and triathletes. Now, I operate a 5 zone system, level 1 through to 5. I use the Roman numerals. Other coaches will use 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the numbers. And some will expand on 5 and have a 5A, 5B, 5C as we talk about different intensities at level 5 or zone 5, as it is also often called. Some coaches will work with a 3 zone system, others will work with a 7 zone system. I keep mine relatively simple without being over simplified. With a 5 zone system, we get 5 distinct energy systems we're targeting. At level 1, targeting recovery. And that's an important intensity for ensuring recovery. Now, if we're doing an appropriate amount of level 2 or aerobic endurance work, we don't need too much of the recovery. Whereas if we're doing a lot of levels 3, 4, and 5, we need a little bit more of that level 1 recovery. Level 3, tempo intensity, level 4, threshold, and then level 5, the VO2 max. We'll go through those in a little bit more detail shortly. Now, the heart rate is the body's response to exercise intensity. If you start working harder, in a minute or two's time, your heart rate will have risen. It's not going to rise immediately. It's not going to be spontaneous. So that delay in the response to your exercise intensity is because the body takes time to adapt to that. However, when we look at power or pace, particularly on the flat for pace, but power regardless of terrain, it's a direct measure of your body's output. That's the intensity. Pace can be influenced by that terrain, as in if you're running up a hill, your pace is going to be slower for the same amount of work that you're doing. Now, a lot of watches these days can display your normalized graded pace or your graded your gap, your graded average pace, which effectively takes into account the terrain and how steep it might be and gives you a faster or slower intensity depending on whether you're going uphill or downhill. So let's have a look at level 1 intensity. It's a lower intensity. It's really good to help flush the legs out, keep that blood moving through the system, clearing out the waste products, whether there's lactic acid, carbon dioxide, or other waste products. It's shipping it off, getting that carbon dioxide to the lungs where you can exhale it out and replace it with oxygen to ship it to the muscles to help with that recovery. With the lactic acid, if there's lactic acid in the system, it'll ship that to the liver where your body will convert that into pyruvate and can use that as an energy system or an energy source. When we step things up to level 2, a lot of these things are still happening. Although we're starting to build your aerobic efficiency, you're getting better at delivering that oxygen from the air in through the mouth, into the lungs, getting absorbed into the blood system, and that oxygen being delivered to those muscles. It's a predominant energy system used for endurance events. So whether you're running a local 5K or doing a half or a full Ironman, this is going to be your key intensity, both for training, and the longer the event, the more likely you'll be using part of level 2 for race intensity. The local 5K, if you're racing it, we're going to be talking about a higher intensity, but the longer events, the half marathons, the marathons, half Ironmans, full Ironmans, even Olympic distance triathlons, we're going to be using the endurance or level 2 intensity. When we step things up to tempo at level 3, it is an intensity that you can sustain for a longer duration. Whether it's a long sustained climb or whether it's an event like a half Ironman, full Ironman, you're not going to be able to sustain the tempo intensity the entire duration, but having some quality training time at level 3 will mean your body is prepared for delivering that intensity during the race. At level 3, a small amount of lactic acid will be being generated, but that's going to be easily cleared by the body. You're not going to accumulate lactic acid. When we step things up to level 4, We're talking about threshold. Now, this is your sustained intensity for shorter events. We're talking about events that are about an hour. So a sprint distance triathlon, a 10K, a very fast half marathon, those sort of events are what we're talking about. We're going to be generating lactic acid, and we're going to need to spend some time just below threshold in order to clear that. And the bigger the gap between your threshold and that you're currently exercising at will determine how quickly you're clearing that. The closer to threshold, the more lactic acid you're generating. Above threshold, you're now starting to generate it at a greater rate than what you can clear. And then finally, looking at level 5, VO2 max. This is your short intensity. Lactic acid is generated rapidly, and you'll need an opportunity to clear that. So whether you're talking about racing a mile or even a 5K, you're going to spend a large portion at level 5 generating that lactic acid. At this intensity training sessions, we're going to be boosting and increasing your VO2 max, your ability to suffer in the short term. It's not an intensity that you can maintain for a long period of time. Can you go higher than level 5? Absolutely you can. And I sort of alluded to that earlier on with some of the training zone prescriptions calling for a zone 5A, zone 5B, zone 5C. Once again, shorter duration. So the true level 5 intervals you'll be holding for no longer than 5 minutes. But if you're only holding them for a minute to 2 minutes, that's like zone 5B. And shorter again, less than a minute, zone 5C. We can and regularly do that in our velocity sessions, depending on what you're training for, potentially doing that intensity with your running as well, but not very often. You need to be training for a short, intense race or a cycle race where there's short, intense portions of that event. Any questions? Jason, you were first here and you're first to shake your head. Jess, any questions from you?
I was gonna ask if like how you determine what our zone 2 is, like for each athlete, how you determine what each person's is.
So it's based off what you can sustain. Now, depending on whether we're talking running or cycling, well, within the disciplines, there's different ways of interpreting it. So I'll start with cycling or even swimming as well. But cycling is relatively easy. Both you and Jason train with power. So we use your calculated FTP and work on a proportion of that. So you both have used the ramp test previously. So we look at your best minute, your final minute in that ramp test, and take 75% of the amount of watts you generated in that minute. And that is it's your theoretical FTP or functional threshold power. The alternative way is using a 20-minute fatigued FTP test. So for that 20 minutes, what you sustain or average for those 20 minutes, we take 95% of that. And the numbers typically end up about the same. And from that, we take a calculation. So for your level 2, it's between 56 and 76% of your FTP. That's level 2. And that's one reason why for all the warm-ups, the cool-downs, a lot of the rest intervals within velocity, you're riding at 66%. We're trying to target the middle portion of that. People that have got quite a low FTP, the plus or minus 30 watts will be a big range between above and below that central point, and it might mean someone riding at the top of their that plus 30 watts is actually at the very bottom end of level 3. And same going the other way, they might be dropping down into level 1. So level 1 being less than 56%, level 2 being the 56 to 76%, level 3 is 77 to 90%, level 4 threshold 91 to 105, so we've got that decent amount under and a little bit above, and then level 5 is 106 to 120% of your functional threshold power. When we're talking about trying to go higher than that, then obviously we're looking at greater than 120%. With running, with our, because I know you use power, Jess, once again, we're looking at typically a 5K result, whether we're looking at power, pace, or heart rate. We look at what your threshold heart rate, power, or pace is, and from there we're using a slightly different calculation because running is different from cycling. We're using different muscles, different muscle mass, because the larger muscle mass with cycling will typically find there's a higher oxygen demand, but also with the running there's a higher impact. So people's the energy cost is often higher with that running. So for running, when we're looking at using power, for level 1, talking sort of 70 to 80% of the your threshold power. Level 2 is 81 to 88%. Level 3, 89 to 95%. Level 4, 96 to 105%. And then for level 5, we're actually taking a wee jump up and going 116 to 128%. With the threshold pace, similar numbers at the lower intensity, 75 to 80 for level 1, 80 to 89% for level 2, 90 to 94% for level 3. Then we jump up a little bit for level 4, 100 to 103%, and then jumping up again for level 5, 110 to 120% of your pace. Your pace doesn't always line up. It's not perfectly linear. It's actually an arch or I forget the technical term for it, but a logarithmic scale. That's the one. Just sort of popped into my head. It's not a straight line. So yeah, Jason's going, that's way too in depth for me. And finally, heart rate. Whether we're talking cycling or running, I use the same calculation for that. And because I don't have many people training with heart rate, I allow the system to effectively calculate that on my behalf. But in terms of level 2, well, we'll start with level 1, 58 to 68%, then 69 to 83% for level 2, 84 to 94% for level 3, 95 to 105% for level 4 or threshold, and then the top end, typically it's going to vary depending on where people's maximum heart rate is, but for the to generate the heart rate, I use the calculation of 106% to 116% for that. So that in a nutshell, I've got a couple of articles that I'll link in the description for the YouTube video, and I'll put it on Facebook if you're interested in reading a little bit more in those numbers and how that's calculated. Any further questions? It was a good one there, Jess. Thank you. Jason.
Yeah, no, sorry.
No, you go, Jess. Jason's slow on the unmute.
No, I was just gonna say like that's helpful because a lot of people when they ask me what my zone 2 is or they see it on my Strava or not, they think my zone 2 is quite fast compared to what they think it should be. And so it's nice to actually know how it's produced.
Yeah, for you, we do a lot of, well, your performance testing is your racing, basically. Whereas for Jason, he's not doing so many races. So he has 5K time trials scheduled. Well, actually, you do a park run most weeks, and I get you to race it every second week. The Dunedin course is a little bit too hilly to get a fast time. So I don't typically use that for yours. But from your race results is where we're generating based on what you can sustain, and it's based off that. And yes, your zone 2 or your level 2 is fast because you are a fast runner.
Thanks, I'll take it as a compliment then.
Absolutely it is. Yeah, the faster someone runs, the faster their respective zones are going to be.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
No worries. Jason, this time I'll let you give some time to unmute.
I think I'm already unmuted.
You absolutely are. Good to
Look at me
go.
go. Um, just wanted to get your thoughts on probably more so relevant for running, but I guess the comparison between the different methods being power, pace, heart rate, that sort of thing, and finding your zones from there. Like which one, what are the benefits and drawbacks of each one versus the others?
So I'll start with heart rate because that's probably the easiest to talk to. Now, when back in the 80s, when heart rate was like everyone knew before the 80s, the faster you went, whether we're talking about caveman times or Greco-Roman Olympics, the faster you went, the more effort you put in, your heart rate elevated, your breathing rate elevated. But it was in the 1980s, technology was around that was able to measure that whilst exercising. And so they could start doing some experiments. A guy, I think his first name was Francesco Conconi, and he did a lot of work with cyclists, particularly around the hour record. And there might be some other dubious medical type stuff he did back then. But his research around heart rate was groundbreaking in relation to intensity. A lot of heart rate initially was based off what someone's maximum was, and there was theoretical maximums, and then there was absolute maximums. You find the absolute maximum out by going and riding your bike or running up a steep hill, and then for the last couple of minutes, absolutely burying yourself, and then had a look and go, oh, my heart rate was 204 beats per minute. And back in the 90s, that's what I used to do with my coach. And everything was based around that maximum heart rate. But then methodology came in where, well, threshold, that's where lactic acid accumulates in the body. Once you exercise above this point, if you're below that point, it clears it. And so a lot of research got developed around that. And it became a better metric using that threshold heart rate. And it was in the 90s where technology started to be developed to measure power output in watts for cyclists. So if we go back to, I think it was on the second or third slide where I talked about heart rate being a response to intensity. Now, if you're riding a steady state time trial or running at steady state for a longer duration, you'll get to a point where, assuming the terrain is relatively stable, it's a gentle incline without a decline, it's consistent, or it's perfectly flat. Then, well, if it's perfectly flat, it's still consistent. As long as that terrain is consistent, you'll get to a point where your heart rate balances out with your effort. And you can look at that and go, well, that's my threshold heart rate. That's what I'm sustaining for the distance or the duration of this effort, whether we're talking cycling, running, swimming, kayaking, whatever. But when we're looking at intervals and training with intervals, the first couple of minutes is going to be getting up to that point. And so that data is effectively irrelevant's not the right word, but it's not beneficial, especially if those intervals are 2 minutes or less. The older you are, the longer it also takes to climb up. So as you start approaching later years in life, it might take 3 or 4 minutes to get to that point. So those threshold type intervals are now getting impacted by this curve getting up to that point. So heart rate is probably the worst to look at. But if it's the only metric we've got, it's acceptable. Another reason for that is terrain. As soon as you start running up a hill, heart rate's going to increase. As soon as you start running downhill, heart rate's going to decrease. So those are two things to factor into any decision making. Heart rate's good to look at, but it shouldn't be the exclusive thing we look at, unless that's all we've got to look at. Next up was pace. And if you look at, and on my wall behind me, not that you can see it, I've got an old cigarette card, not Weet-Bix cards, cigarette cards from the 1920s and 1930s of a guy called Jack Lovelock. And somewhere I've got his diaries. They're possibly at arm's reach. Can't see them immediately. He was a New Zealand runner that won a gold medal at the 1936 Berlin Olympics for 1500 metres. He's actually from the West Coast. I drove past his old house today, a little place called Crushington. he was born there. He didn't spend much time there, but it's quite significant for the few people left living in this town called Crushington that Jack Lovelock came from there. He did all his training based on pace. He did it all on a 400-meter athletics track. The coach stood there with a stopwatch and timed him. If the coach wasn't there, he timed himself. I was recently in Helsinki, and I went to the Helsinki Olympic Stadium where they have their sports museum. And out the front, there's a statue of a guy called Lassie Viren, who he was the master of obeying the watch. Everything he did was with a stopwatch, and the stopwatch he used in the build up to, I forget, the Olympics, one of the Olympics where he won a number of significant medals. His stopwatch is in the museum, so I had a lot of time enjoying looking at that piece of history. So pace was relevant, and an athletics track is nice and flat. It's a consistent surface the whole way around. So pace, being consistent, was a measure of the intensity output. But along came a guy called Arthur Lydiard in the 60s who got his athletes jogging out in the hills and uphill and down dale. And the likes of Roger Bannister from Chariots of Fire running along the beach. All of a sudden, terrain had ups and downs for training, and pace was no longer able to be consistent. That didn't really affect them. They just got sent and tasked with going out and doing these run sessions. The key sessions they did on the tracks were still nice and consistent. These days, we've got technology on our wrist that will measure our pace and give us instantaneous feedback. You don't need to wait 400 meters for the coach to tell you how fast or how slow you ran and to tell you to run faster or slower depending on your performance. Now you've got it on your watch. You can set it to beep if you're going too fast or beep if you're going too slow, and you can very accurately modulate your intensity. The downside comes when the terrain changes and start going uphill. All of a sudden you're going too slow based on what the watch is wanting you to do, but the terrain has changed. If you've got your watch set to graded average pace or normalized graded pace and displaying that, it's going to effectively smooth it out and give you the pace or the intensity that you're running, assuming it was flat, although you're not running on the flat. So that is a good way to manage that. And that is one reason why I prefer pace over heart rate for running. When we come to cycling, pace isn't really reliable. Hills have a lot more of an impact. So pace has never really been used for cycling. And not many people do all their training exclusively on the velodrome because the races are off, or the majority of races are off velodromes. Even the very early bike races, they were all on roads, and then the velodrome came next. Whereas running races were typically on the athletics track with a few exceptions. With the development of a power meter in the mid-90s, although initially lab-based, it soon moved to be portable technology that wasn't necessarily the cheapest or most available to cyclists and triathletes that were keen to use it. Power measured how much work you were actually doing, how much force you were putting on the pedals, and gave you an absolute number. Now that force you were putting on the pedals was irrelevant to the terrain. Yep, going uphill, you can generate more force by putting in more effort in combination with the hill, but you can also back off and ride hills at that lower intensity. And so that was a good tool because it was measuring your output purely, irrelevant of what the terrain was. 300 watts on a hill is the same as 300 watts on the flat, which is the same as 300 watts on the downhill. So that technology was a game changer for cycling. So for those reasons, power has been my prime metric for cyclists that have access to it for a long time. Power meters these days, 25, 30 years later, are significantly cheaper and a whole lot more accurate and a whole lot more reliable. My first power meter I bought in the end of 2002. It was a polar wind power meter that measured chain oscillations. it was very pedantic, and it worked, if I was lucky, 20% of the time. And the data it gave me was probably plus or minus 10%. So if I was doing 200 watts, it meant I was somewhere between 180 watts and 220 watts. It wasn't the most reliable thing, and I spent far too long trying to get it to work properly. Yeah, that's a whole nother story. But nowadays, trainers particularly, as well as the built-in power meters that on your bike that you can ride outdoors, pedal-based, whether it's with Favaro or Garmin, whether it's spider-based. There are a few exceptions of, I'll say, a less reliable power meters. And if you do some Googling of the worst power meter with the worst accuracy, there's a few key people that will say which brand that is. I won't throw them under the bus here because I know neither of you are using that brand. Well, you might be using that brand, but not for a power meter. So for those reasons, for cycling, my preference is for power. Now, coming to running, in recent years, in the last, I've had my running power meter for about 8 years when I first got my Stride, and it was about then that Garmin released running power onto a number of their Phoenix and their Forerunner models. And shortly afterwards, Apple Watch and Coros and a couple of other brands also released their versions of power for running. The idea behind power for running is it's trying to, I'm not going to use the word measure, but it's trying to estimate the amount of power you are generating to push off from the earth with your running stride, so you can also have a consistent measure of output. So whether you're running uphill, downhill, or on the flat, 300 watts is 300 watts. Now, I believe, and there's research to support this, that the Stride power meter, which is a foot pod, is a lot more accurate than some of the other estimations, because they are actually measuring some or more of the metrics than the likes of Garmin or Coros or Apple. But the important thing is that this power data is consistent. And that's the key thing across the brands. Apple is consistent with Apple. Garmin is consistent with with Garmin, etc. So if you had a Garmin on one watch, Coros on the other, and a Stride foot pod, 300 watts, they're all going to say slightly different things. One might say 320, one might say 300, and the other one might say 280. But the one that says 300, whenever that's saying 300, you should find that the other two are saying pretty close to the 320 or the 280. So being consistent. So you don't need to have the latest Stride to be consistent and accurate, as long as the version you've got is consistent with itself. And if you look at some of the work DC Rainmaker has done, just search dcrainmaker.com, and you'll be able to find a lot of his research and comparison of models between each other. So if a runner has got power data that is used regularly, like you do, Jess, I will use that over pace, I'll say 98% of the time, because there might be some key sessions where we do use pace, particularly on an athletics track, where we're trying to target something for people training to race track events, particularly, as opposed to the longer half marathon, 10K on the road type events, where the power data is typically going to be what the running targets are based off. I know it's a long-winded way of saying it, but the short answer is power for cycling and running if it's available for them. For cycling, heart rate will be behind power. For running, pace is not far behind power. And then heart rate is my preferred order. And swimming, obviously a swimming pool is a swimming pool. Whether it's a 50-meter one, a 33-meter, or a 25-meter pool, it's going to be consistent from length to length. So pace in the pool is my key metric I'm looking at, although you can't swim along and look at your watch and know how fast you're swimming precisely. Subjectively, you'll have an idea. So pace for swimming, And if you record, or you've got the ability to record heart rate, which some of the newer models with infrared heart rate sensors on the back of them can do reliably now. Not that long ago, it was pretty unreliable. So that's what I use for swimming. Open water swimming, once again, using pace with a pinch of salt, because currents, waves, conditions, water temperature can be extremely varied in an open water environment, even from one point to another point within the same workout. That's the short answer after the long answer. Anything you'd like expanded on there, Jason?
No, but I would like to clarify whether that pinch of salt was a sea-based joke.
Not intentionally, but yeah, that slipped in there. Good spotting.
No, you've actually answered my follow-up question, which was around the pacing around hills and that sort of thing as well. I probably just need to adjust the settings on the watch so that I've got the gradient adjusted pace showing, and that probably solves my problem. So great
Yeah,
work in answering my future question.
yeah, though it's only really in the or this year that sort of data has become available regularly and reliably on watches. So if you're operating on a watch that's a little bit older, it might not have that capability, but with some software upgrades, it may have, depending on which watch you've got. Looked like you had a question that developed from that the answer I gave Jason there, Jess.
Yeah, no, every question I thought I was going to ask you ended up answering it anyway, so it was perfect. Thank you. So, no, I have no more questions.
Sweet. Anything further from you, Jason, about today's topic or training in general? Sweet. Anything from you in general today, Jess? Perfect. Well, we'll wrap things up. Thank you for joining me today. Ka kite anō. Have a fantastic day.
Thank you, Ray.
Cheers, Ray.
You're welcome.